Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. In the name of Allah, we praise and we thank Allah. We praise Him for His perfect, beautiful attributes that only He is describable with. And we thank Him for His countless favors and His graciousness. And we ask Him to raise the mention of and grant eternal peace to the Messenger of Allah, Nabiyyina Muhammad, our Prophet Muhammad, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathira, and to raise the rank and mention of and grant peace to his family and his companions. To begin, Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, He said in His book, describing all of the disbelievers and all of the mushrikeen. أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ أَفَأَنْتَ تَكُونُ عَلَيْهِ وَكِيلًا. Do you not see, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the one who has taken his desires as his deity, the one who has taken his own desires as his deity? أَفَأَنْتَ تَكُونُ عَلَيْهِ وَكِيلًا. Could you ever be a guardian for him, meaning against Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala? وَقَالَ جَلَّ ثَنَاؤُهُ. Likewise, Allah, majestic is His mention. He says Tabarak wa Ta'ala in His book, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُ هَوَاهُ وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. Don't you see the one who has taken, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ, who has taken his God as his desires, وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala set that person astray. Allah made that person to deviate and go astray, despite their having knowledge of the truth, despite having certainty of correct beliefs and correct morals and so on and so forth. The person, he followed his whims and he followed his desires and he took them as a God besides Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala. Today, insha'Allah Ta'ala, in light of these two verses and in light of a statement attributed to some of these Sahaba, وَدَّتْ الزَّانِيَةِ لو أنا النساء كلهن زواني. That the fornicatress, that the person who falls into illicit sexual relations and indecency and immorality wishes that the rest of the women and the rest of the people would be like them. We want to talk about what is commonly referred to as the cult of the self. The cult of the self, what is sometimes called the culture of authenticity. And to trace some of the history behind it that has led us to the current moment in the Western world and in the world in general. Going back for some time, but specifically from around the time of the European Enlightenment in the late 18th century up until the current era. And when we arrive at the current era, we're going to talk about what is called the therapeutic culture. The therapeutic culture. We're going to talk about the contours of the modern self and what constitutes selfhood and identity in the modern world today, and what forms the basis of education and forms the basis of inauthentic morality, and what forms the basis of governance in the Western world that has become a replacement religion and a replacement God in the world in which we live. One of the phrases that is commonly used in the current era is that a person should live their truth. To live your truth. The truth to them is intuitional. It is something that comes from within. It is a gut feeling. It's how the person feels. And what they feel comfortable with. And their impulses and their urges and their desires is their personal truth. And this matter and this false belief is at the core and has been at the core of Western thought from its inception and from its beginning, from the time of the Greco-Persian Wars, hundreds of years before Isa bin Umar alayhi salatu wasalam, during the rise of Hellenism and the rise of Greek philosophy, and it is a syncretistic, and it is to bring multiple cultures and multiple belief systems together into a hodgepodge, mishmash, sludge that is contradictory in nature. And Western thought is premised upon, and as it relates to its view of the truth, is premised upon a number of things. And this is what we'll open up the talk with, inshallah ta'ala. Firstly, the belief that there is an actual truth, that the truth exists. The truth is out there somewhere. And there is no viable culture, there is no person, there is no way to have identity for anybody, Muslim or non-Muslim, for a certainty without the truth. And the truth is how, in Islam, the truth is defined in the Arabic language as what is real in the witnessable world and the world of the unseen, and how one ought to be. What is real, what is factual, and how one ought to be, how one should be. Al-khabr wal-insha, al-khabr sadiq, true information from reliable sources. There is no one more truthful than Allah, and none more truthful than the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and none more truthful than the ulama of Islam, Ahlul Hadith wal Athar al-Udul, and the trustworthy carriers of the religion over the course of place and time, who came with the teachings of the religion and the explanation and the understanding and proper interpretation of those teachings as relates to the rights of Allah and the rights of people, and what is correct beliefs and how one ought to be. And so the opposite is found in the Western world, that they believe and have always believed in their various iterations and the various versions of Western thought from the beginning of the concept of there being a place called the West, and up until today, that there is a truth, that the truth is out there somewhere. However, the truth is something that no one can fully reach. It's something that no one can fully reach. They never had anything that was authoritative enough to identify as being the final truth. The final truth. And so, the truth exists, they say, and they purport it from the time of the Greek philosophers and all throughout, in word and in deed. The truth exists. However, there is no absolute or final authority. There is no absolute or final authority because no one has the full picture of the truth. Because no one has a full picture of the truth. But rather, every person of goodwill, every person who feels warm and fuzzy inside, and who claims to have a good intention, they say, and they claim that every person of goodwill has their own version of the truth and their own perspective that is based upon their intuition and based upon their personal life experiences. And they say that through discussion and debate, and disputing about what one has learned or one has experienced, that these differing viewpoints and these aspects of the truth can be pulled together. They can be pulled together to form a temporary consensus. A temporary consensus that is an approximation of the truth, that is close to the truth and closer to the truth than individual sources. However, it is just a temporary approximation. It's temporary in its nature, and it can change very quickly as people go through new experiences, and as people receive additional information, they reformulate what is the truth with them. And so the truth with them is always a process of becoming. And that people are in a process of becoming, and Western society is in a process of becoming its best self. And people get successively closer to the truth. Slowly but surely they claim without ever fully reaching it. And so this mysterious process of becoming went through many different versions, and we're going to jump forward in history past the paganization of Christianity, when the teachings of Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salatu wasalam were given a Western interpretation, a philosophical, metaphysical interpretation by the early church fathers. And then after that, with these schisms in the church, and then after that, with what is called the Germanization of Christianity, where the people of Western Europe, the Germanic tribes, accepted Christianity and blended their pagan beliefs and their pagan celebrations with Catholicism and the cult of the saints, and took the celebrations that they were upon and the beliefs that they were upon and merged them with Christianity. And it remained like that for a long period of time. And as we jump forward in history to the 16th century with the rise of Protestantism and the advent of Martin Luther, then Christianity split between Catholicism and Protestantism, and Protestantism was based upon just that, protesting the teachings of the Catholic Church and the corruption of the Catholic Church and the worship of the saints, on all these sorts of things. And they introduced the concept and gave focus to a concept of what they call the agency of the Holy Spirit, in a way that had not been formulated in the same way before, where they said that every person who is upon Christianity, every person who is a true Christian, that they have the ability to interpret Scripture for themselves, to read the Bible, they said, for themselves, and to interpret it for themselves. And so this caused Christianity to schism, Protestantism to schism into many different directions and many different sects. And what had existed and had been under the radar to a great deal, and to a great degree, a great deal, and of the occultic beliefs, and of the practice of witchcraft and magic and occultism and so on and so forth, started to resurface all throughout the Western Christian world. And we find ourselves at a turning point in Christianity and a turning point in Western thought, and with the advent of the Enlightenment, or with the time of the Enlightenment in the 18th century, where you had a number of thinkers who said that private vice and private behavior and even if it is sinful, and even if it is built upon greed, and that which is not of a benefit, and that it has the potential for, or it gives rise to, public virtue. And it's a public virtue. It is for the greater good that people pursue their self-interest. It is for the greater good that people pursue their desires, and that what occurs within the confines of one's home and one's private life is nobody's business. That is nobody's business. And that, in fact, the economy of the world will benefit greatly from people being however they want to be in private. And that this became the concept of authenticity. And this was something that was promoted by a number of Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and like René Descartes and others from the Enlightenment thinkers, and who said that, firstly, selfhood and identity and what makes a person who they are, as opposed to the Islamic concept and the Islamic outline and framework, that what makes a person virtuous and what makes a person live a good life is righteousness and obedience to Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala, and enjoying and being grateful for what Allah has permitted of the things of this world, and building a family, and working for the hereafter, and fulfilling one's societal role. That they flipped the script on that, and they said that what brings a person happiness is two things. Firstly, authentic selfhood is that a person turns inwardly, that they look inwardly, and that their passions and their desires and their wants and their urges is who they authentically are, and who they authentically are, and that they are naturally good, that they are naturally good, and what they want is naturally good. And secondly, that what keeps people from being their authentic selves is society at large, and the role of religion in society, and the role of governance in society, and that society itself victimizes people, and the traditional mores of society repress people and keep them from being their authentic selves. And so the claim is that the modern self is realized, that a person becomes their authentic self, that authenticity is achieved by a person acting outwardly and according to one's inward feelings, and that a person, that their self is divine, or is part divine, that their self, their soul is divine, and that the world and society is a prison, keeping them from authenticity and keeping them from true happiness. And so an inward and downward reorientation occurs, and as opposed to what was traditionally held by societies, Muslim or non-Muslim, that happiness in life and purpose in life and heroism and bravery and valor comes by a person working for the hereafter, working for the next life, holding on to their religious morals and fulfilling their societal role, as comes in its correct form in the statement of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that is found in the hadith of Abu Hurairah in the Jami of Tirmidhi, in the hadith that is Hasan, that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam su'ila an akthari ma yudkhilu an-nas an-nar. He was asked about the thing that enters people into hellfire the most. And he said, al-ajwafan, al-fam wal-faraj. He said there are al-ajwafan, two parts of the body, the mouth and the private parts. The mouth and the private parts, what a person says with their tongue and what they ingest into their stomach and what they do with their private parts. And a person's appetites for food and for sexual intercourse, akramakumullah. And the way that they speak and what they use their tongue for is the most likely thing to enter a person into the hellfire. These people, they say that happiness comes in a person outwardly expressing with his tongue and advocating what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden. And at the head of that is illicit sexual relations outside of marriage, as we'll come to see, which would eventually become the linchpin and the core of what identified people historically. And the Prophet ﷺ was then asked, عن أكثر سئل ما أكثر ما يدخل الجنة. What is the thing that will enter people into paradise the most? And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, تقوى الله وحسن الخلق. It is to have taqwa of Allah, to behave in such a way to protect yourself from Allah's anger and punishment in the hereafter. وحسن الخلق, and good character in dealing with others. And good character in dealing with others. Likewise, the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith of Abdullah ibn Amr in Sahih Muslim, he was asked sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, or the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, rather, he said, فَمَنْ أَرَادَ, after mentioning how fitan would come, يُرَقِقُ بَعْضُهَا بَعْضًا, and in increasing severity. Every time trials and temptations come, they will make the previous and prior trials and tribulations seem insignificant in comparison. And he said, فَمَنْ أَرَادَ أَنْ يُزَحْزَحَ عَنِ النَّارِ وَيُدْخَلَ الْجَنَّةِ فَلْتَأْتِهِ مَنِيَّتُهُ. And whoever would like to be distanced far away from the hellfire and entered into paradise, then let him reach his maniyah, his death, his demise, while he yu'minu billahi wal yawm al-akhir, while he believes in Allah and the last day. وَلْيَأْتِيَ لَلنَّاسَ الَّذِي يُحِبْ أَنْ يُؤْتَى إِلَيْهِ. And let him treat people and deal with people in the way that he would like to be dealt with and treated himself. Let him treat and deal with people the way that he would like to be treated and the way that he would like to be dealt with. And so the orientation became turned upside down, and with that came a loss of meaning. And the purpose of life became, in the Western world, increasingly, and the purpose of the institutions of society, from education up to governance, increasingly became, instead of looking towards the hereafter, to look down towards this world, and to make the primary focus this world. The Prophet ﷺ, he sought refuge with Allah from that. The Prophet ﷺ and his companions, they were intelligent and they were the wisest of people when it came to governance, and when it came to political matters, and when it came to trade and business and so on and so forth. And they did that, and they were able to do that by making the hereafter their priority. As comes in the statement of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in which the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, "Man ja'ala al-akhirata hamma," and whoever makes the hereafter his main concern, jama' Allahu shamla, and Allah will organize his worldly matters for him. Wa wada'a ghinahu fi qalbihi, and he will place richness in that person's heart. Wa ta'atihi ad-dunya wa hiya raghima, and the dunya will be forced to come to that person. And the dunya of this world will be forced to come to that person. وَمَنْ جَعَلَ الْآخِرَةَ هَمَّهُ, and whoever makes الدنيا ومن جعل الدنيا همه, whoever makes this world their main concern and their main ambition, فرق الله عليه شمله, and Allah will scatter and disorganize his worldly matters. وجعل الفقر بين عينيه, and He will place poverty between that person's eyes. All he will see is poverty. وَلَمْ يَأْتِيهِ مِنَ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا مَا كُتِبَ لَهُ, and nothing will come to him of this world except for what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had already written for him. Meaning that his sustenance will not be blessed and his efforts will be in vain on the day that he meets Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, and the blessings of Allah tabarak wa ta'ala upon him in a worldly sense will be wabal, and he will be a source of destruction for him in the hereafter. And so the orientation became completely different from looking upward towards the meeting with the Creator and preparing for the hereafter, and he too looking downward towards this world. And the Prophet ﷺ sought refuge with Allah from that. And the well-known dua, and which the Prophet ﷺ, the lengthy dua, part of which the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Allahumma wa la taj'al dunya akbara hammina wa la mablagha ilmina. Oh Allah, do not allow this world to be our highest concern, or do not allow this world to be the extent of our knowledge or our greatest concern. The extent of our knowledge or our greatest concern. And so, in a word, what this selfhood is, and what this authentic identity as they claim it is, what it is individualism. Individualism. And that people, they believe that as individuals, focusing upon one's personal concerns and making that their priority, that they live their most authentic lives, and that a person has not truly lived until they have checked off everything off their bucket list, any of their personal whims and their personal desires, and so on and so forth. And one of the most disturbing aspects of this, with this loss of meaning, and with this loss of what gives a person valor and virtue in life, and he is the abolition of shame. The abolition of shame by way of the normalization and the celebration and the valorization of sexual indecency and deviancy, such as homosexuality and today transgenderism and pornography and promiscuity. And this began at least 200 years ago in the Western world. And it increased in its tempo, and it increased in its severity to a point that is beyond what anybody could have imagined even 20 years ago or 30 years ago. A poet famously said, وَإِنَّمَا الْأُمَمُ الْأَخْلَاقُ مَا بَقِيَتْ فَإِنْهُمُ ذَهَبَتْ أَخْلَاقُهُمْ ذَهَبُوا. That nations are only determined by their morals and their ethics. Nations are only determined by al-akhlaq, their morals and their ethics and their virtues. مَا بَقِيَتْ, so long as those ethics and those morals and those virtues survive and remain, فَإِنْهُمُ ذَهَبَتْ أَخْلَاقُهُمْ ذَهَبُوا, they will remain. They will survive so long as their morals and their values and their virtues survive. فَإِنْهُمُ ذَهَبَتْ أَخْلَاقُهُمْ ذَهَبُوا, and once they will depart. This is the reason for the decline and the fall of nations. And so the contours and the descriptions of the Western South are focused around this matter of individualism that we describe, and of a person determining who they are going to be outwardly by their inward passions and their inward desires, without any mi'ar, without any thing to judge by of traditional morality or revealed religion or anything of the sort. It is instantaneous gratification. It is a immediate and a limited outlook at life that causes a tafakkuk, and that causes the fragmentation of society and the fragmentation of the family. Secondly, after individualism is the means to achieve personal growth, as they say, and inexorable progress, as they claim, and social progress and individual progress, and which is to give the greatest focus in education to material knowledge and scientific knowledge and technological advancement. There is no doubt that individualism by itself, that a person is not swayed by the majority and that they think for themselves in light of the truth and in light of their actual fitrah, that is something that is praiseworthy. There is much merit to it. But without that, without divine revelation, without guidance for a person to identify right from wrong, and where the individual self is assigned the status of divinity and made an actual God in the minds and the hearts of people. And there is no doubt that that is the most destructive matter. And there is no doubt that science and scientific advancement and technology is of great importance in the world today, and in every time and every place has been of great importance to people, and is necessary for safety and security and prosperity and so on and so forth. But when that becomes the most important thing to learn about, and when moral education and religious education is said to be a matter of aesthetics, a matter of taste, that doesn't measure up to the scientific method, they say, then you have what is called scientism, the abuse of science and the misuse of science and the misuse of technology, and the application of science and scientific method to things that it is inapplicable to, from human behavior and from the realm of politics and diplomacy and ethics and morality and so on and so forth. And so what comes as a result of the combination of these two things, when the entirety of the focus, or the greatest focus that is given by society at large and the individuals that comprise the society and the identity of those people collectively, and he is the focus on the self and the desires of the self, and that everybody lives their own truth and is entitled to their own opinion about every single matter, and that what is most important is personal advancement and one's own pocket, and the way to get that, which is scientific knowledge and technological progress and so on and so forth, that what comes as a result of that is a loss of natural freedom. A loss of natural freedom. As was stated by an Imam, Shaykh al-Islam, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyyah rahimahullah ta'ala, most eloquently. And I have been blessed to have gathered a good amount of that information in the publication Winning the War Within, when he said rahimahullah ta'ala in his Nuniyah, فَرُّوا مِنَ الرِّقِّ الَّذِي خُلِقُوا لَهُ فَبُرُوا بِرِقِّ النَّفْسِ وَالشَّيْطَانِ, that they fled, that people fled from the servitude, meaning the loving worship of Allah Tabarak wa Ta'ala that they have been created for, the servitude that they have been created for. فَبُرُوا بِرِقِّ النَّفْسِ وَالشَّيْطَانِ, and as a result of that, they were afflicted by becoming the slaves of their own selves and the slaves of the shaitan. By slavery to the self and slavery to the shaitan. So much has been written in the history of Islam of adab al-nafs, disciplining the soul, imparting virtuous character to the soul, and of muhasabatun nafs, jihadun nafs, of struggling against the soul, struggling against the inner self. and the harmful impulses and passions of the inner self. And to the point that this is the core of Islam. Allah sent guidance to the Prophet ﷺ to remove people from the passions and the desires of their souls to being the loving worshippers of Ar-Rahman Tabarak wa Ta'ala. And this is a Sa'adatul Abadiyya, Jarrib Tajid. And this is eternal happiness for a person in this world and the next. Any person who attempts to try the Islamic method with genuineness and sincerity, they will find this to be the case. They will find that the more they know of the religion, and the more that affects their ambition, and the more that affects their intention, and the more that affects their character, and the more that affects their behavior, and fulfilling Allah's rights, and the rights of other people, including the rights of their own self, the happier they will be, the more dignified they will be, the more prosperous they will be as individuals and families and as communities and entire societies and nations. And that whenever this is lost, whenever this formula of beneficial religious knowledge, coupled with sincere intention and high ambition, coupled with high lofty morality and dignified conduct, that when that is lost, then that is the cause of the decline of nations and the collapse of societies. And so what comes as a result of the combination of the turn inward and downward, and of making one's entire purpose of life, and what gives a person meaning, and what makes you, what makes a person's identity, and what makes a person having an authentic life, and it becomes a turn downward and inward, where a person looks at their personal whims without any consideration of the actual truth, and they say that their emotions and their feelings are divine in origin, and that they are the truth, that their intuitions and their gut feeling that is the truth, and that their personal advancement and their personal prosperity and wealth, it becomes a culture of adolescence and a culture of juvenility that doesn't have any grit or any resilience or the coping mechanisms that are necessary to survive the trials of life. And the entirety of the focus of education and governance and so on and so forth becomes the advancement of technology and scientific discovery and so on and so forth. Then you have what is called a bureaucratic culture, and a culture of bureaucracy, of educational bureaucracies, and corporate bureaucracies, and governmental bureaucracies, whose purpose is to guarantee the living standards of people. Not what is of a greater good for them actually, not what is better for them ethically and morally, but what will make them happy and what will keep them placated, what will keep them docile. And this is what has been referred to by many Western writers as soft despotism. And it is the manipulation of society by way of corruption. It's to rule people by corruption and keep them weak and keep them downtrodden and keep them ignorant and keep them docile by way of the valorization of corruption and immorality and so on and so forth. And so a number of phases were passed through to get to the point that we are at today. We mentioned the first phase, and we mentioned the first phase in the modern era, which was the time of the Enlightenment and some of the Enlightenment thinkers, and the rise of the concept that political and social change drastic socio-political change is very possible, and that the authority to carry out that change is in the hands of individuals. And so it became what some have called a fire in the minds of men, the revolutionary faith, a faith of rebellion, a replacement of religion that was promoted and that came to a boiling point during the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century with the mottos of al-hurriya wal-ikha wal-musawa, al-hurriya wal-ikha wal-musawa, and of liberty or freedom, and al-ikha, fraternity, and al-musawa, and equality. And these three mottos, these three slogans of the French Revolution and the reign of terror, with all the guillotines and heads rolling and so on and so forth, and in all the blood that was shed at that time, materialized, and they were the slogans first and foremost of Freemasonry. And they materialized into three different political systems that would wage war against each other at the turn of the 20th century for almost the first half of the 20th century. And they were capitalism, because liberty and freedom meant economic freedom, and free trade. Al-Ikha, fraternity and brotherhood, meaning nationalism, which was fascism, and social democracy, which was Nazism. And al-musawa, and equality, which was communism and socialism, met each other. These ideologies, they met each other on the battlefield for much of the first half of the 20th century and caused bloodshed and devastation beyond what the world has ever seen before or since. And so this is enough for us in reality. It's enough for us in reality to see the reality of the end game and the end result of ittiba' al-hawa, of one following their desires. And the believer doesn't have to learn the hard way. And the believer, he knows that if his nafs, if his own self, if it is left untamed and unchecked, is the worst enemy that he has, that gives authority to the shaitan over him, and that forsakes him and leaves him in a pitiful condition. Then what about the nafs of another person? What about the anfus of other people? What about other people's souls and selves and their personal objectives and their personal goals and what they are after? And so a number of movements throughout the long 19th century came into prominence that deified the self of the person, that deified the self of the person. And after Mathalan, and you have what is called the American creed of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That the pursuit of happiness, it became a human right. It became a human right, not inclusive for everybody, but inclusive to certain demographics of people that were the ruling classes and that were the ethnic majority. And in the United States and elsewhere, and the Anglo-American world and the Euro-American world and that sort of thing. And you had a movement in the first half of the 19th century, and between around 1800 and 1840, that was called Romanticism. When you hear the word Romanticism, what comes to mind? What comes to mind when you hear the word romantic? What comes to mind? What does it mean? A person is romantic. They say that guy's a romantic over there. What does that mean?
It's French.
It's French? What does it mean though? That means like love, passion, like marital love, or like relationship, like relational love, that sort of thing. So the Romanticists, they taught that nature was divine, and they looked at the developments of urban society, and they had nostalgia for the past, and they tried to look into the pagan past for the source of happiness before Christianity. And they said they didn't believe in any given religion, and they were a number of poets and playwrights and even painters and artists and so on and so forth, and musical composers. And they had a movement for the first half of the 18th century, from 1800 or so to 1840, and where they placed divinity in nature. And within nature, and they said was part of nature was man, and he returned back to nature. Returned back to nature as a source of happiness, and he leaving the urban centers and the squalor of the urban centers and so on and so forth, returned back to nature. And with that, they purported that, and they claimed that one of the greatest source of authenticity and happiness for the self is romantic love. And this became something that was widely studied and widely memorized by the upper echelons of society and by those who were well-to-do, as well by some of the poorer classes who were literate. And it became the digest of the people and the media that they consumed for the first half of the 18th century. And the second half of the 18th century, you had a movement in America that was called transcendentalism. And where they say that mankind has transcended societal norms and societal expectations and so on and so forth. You had a number of people like Thoreau and others, and who, along with this return back to nature, that they said explicitly that the self is divine, that the inner self of the person, that it is divine, and that happiness resides in a person living their most authentic life, living their most authentic life. And at the same time, in Europe, you had the rise of occultism, you had the rise of theosophy, you had the rise of what will become in the 1950s and 60s New Age spirituality, Eastern religions being discovered, and in the colonies and the lands in the East especially that had been colonized by the European powers, that they exported translations of the Hindu text and of Taoism and Confucianism and every other type of ism, and from Eastern spirituality back home, back to the West. And people, they wanted something exotic and they wanted something different. That wasn't Christianity. And they wanted to have some identity that was different than everything in the past. That was different than everything in the past. And during the second half, likewise, of the 19th century, meaning the 1800s, you had the writings of Charles Darwin, The Origin of Species, and the Survival of the Fittest, and these sorts of concepts that claimed that human beings were just intelligent animals. That they were just intelligent animals, which reinforced this long-standing belief and claim that authentic selfhood and true identity, and he is by a person looking inward at their gut feeling and how they personally feel and what they personally want, and that sort of thing. And along with that, you had the writings of Sigmund Freud, and who was a cokehead. And there is much that has been written. There is an entire book actually that was written about how Freud's best epiphany moments in his mind, where he came up with many of his theories that sexualized identity, that placed what a person is and who a person is, not just in their desires and their inner feelings, but their sexual feelings and their sexual urges. That he came to these conclusions while coked out of his mind. He arrived at these conclusions while coked out of his mind, snorting cocaine and abusing opium and so on and so forth. And so you have this perverted person, Sigmund Freud, who sexualized identity and who came up and who was a pioneer of the field of psychoanalysis that would turn into psychology and social psychology and other things, and who sexualized identity. Then at the same time, you had the teachings of Karl Marx, which politicized identity and pitted mankind as the victors and the victims. The victors and the victims. And it is time for the poor and the downtrodden and the victims to overthrow their overseers and their imperial lords and so on and so forth, to rise up and to revolt and to give authority to the masses. And so the teachings of Marxism taught that people are either victims or victors, and it placed identity, a focus on identity, on victimhood. And likewise, at the same time, around that same period of time, in the latter half of the 19th century, you had what is called al-wujudiyya, which are the teachings of the likes of Nietzsche and others, and who said that men are divine, human beings are divine, and who claimed the death of God, who claimed that the belief in God has died, and claimed what is called the disenchantment of the world. And that the world has lost any type of enchantment, any belief in the unseen is thrown out of the door, and that who you are is how you feel. That who you are is how you feel, and that human beings have the potential, if they were to tap into their willpower, if they were to tap into their willpower and trust in themselves, and to have confidence in themselves, to become gods, and to evolve into gods. And this is the sludge and the filth that became globalized throughout the second half of the 19th century, that led, as can be proved empirically, and has been written about exhaustively by Western academics and historians themselves, that led to the atrocities and the bloodshed of the first half of the 20th century. Of the first half of the 20th century, with the world wars, with the Cold War, and the spread of communism and so on and so forth. After the world wars, we have what was called the rise of the Therapeutic. Wokeism is an extension of the Therapeutic culture, was the popularization, taking away all of the babble and all of the clear foolishness of the New Age beliefs of Eastern spirituality, so on and so forth, that gave people a boost in self-esteem by claiming that they were divine, and that their souls were divine, and that authenticity resided within a person tapping into their inner potential without any other consideration. And these sorts of beliefs, and that people are one with the divine, and that the self, if left to its desires and left to its whims and left to achieve what it sets out to achieve, that it will become one with nature, and that nature is God, and that this is without a doubt pantheism, and this is a belief in wahdatul wujud, and in the oneness of existence, that a person becomes one with the universe. And you have all of these sorts of belief systems connected to chi, and connected to other forms of Eastern spirituality, and that a person is one with the universe and use the force, and all these sorts of things that are found in popular literature and popular media and movies and so on and so forth. And so the therapeutic culture was a way to give a scientific or a pseudo-scientific interpretation to the New Age. And it consists of a number of things, and we'll close on these points. The first, is a cultural, widespread preoccupation with the individual self, to replace religion and traditional morality, with the individual self and the desires of the self as a dominant way of viewing the world and your purpose and your meaning in life. Secondly, a notable concern with the place of emotions and making sense of who you are and your place in the world. And this is what we already heard. This was something that had been building up 4 generations by that point. Thirdly, and this is what made the period after the world wars different up until today, with the counterculture and the therapeutic culture, and the emergence of a new class of counselors and psychologists and therapists that are socially recognized and accredited as the experts in their field, as the most qualified to educate the children, as the most qualified to guide the self and its emotions and the complexities of the emotions throughout the chaos of modern social life. Next, the reinterpretation of many behaviors, and as being things that were incurable, things that are, labeled as addictions and disorders and dysfunctions, things that people have always dealt with generally, of unhealthy impulses, unhealthy urges, of depression and sorrow and sadness that comes naturally in life, and anxieties that come naturally in life, saying that the only way to navigate through one's feelings is to go to a specialist and to go to an expert, and that parents are not equipped to do that for their children, and that clergy and religious leaders are not equipped to do that for their communities, and that in order for government policy to be based upon, or to be effective and to be something that is quote unquote progressive, that it must be based upon some pseudoscientific theories connected to all of this psychobabble. Lastly, and this segues into tomorrow's talk, bi'idhnillahi tabarak wa ta'ala, that it became widespread culturally. It became culturally widespread and accepted, to use the language of victimhood. That a person is victim of circumstance, women are the victims of men, things like the patriarchy, anybody who stops you or disagrees with you or does not celebrate or valorize or applaud you for your sexual proclivities, that person has victimized you. That person has victimized you. That anybody who is in between you, or anything or any creed that is in between you and your authentic self, has victimized you and has oppressed you and has oppressed you. And so a culture of victimhood, where every trifling inconvenience in the life of a person is labeled to be trauma, and people are looked at to be frail and fragile and vulnerable creatures that cannot survive without the guidance of counselors and therapists and so on and so forth. And this became commonplace. This became commonplace. And so this is where we conclude this evening. And tomorrow, inshallah ta'ala, we build on some of what we heard today to speak about wokeism and the reality of wokeism and waking up to this bitter ideology, this cynical ideology, that has the world by its clutches. In the time in which we live, everything, victimize another person or victimize another person, all of these sources of absurdities. We ask Allah tabarak wa ta'ala to protect us and our children and our communities from the influx of these poisonous doctrines. هذا وصلى اللهم وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.